Today I'm going to answer some questions by a student named Peter Milanovsky. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He has some questions about the current and voltages in an inductor and about the inductor that's an electromagnet in a relay and how and why we put a diode across it. So let's take a quick look at how the currents and magnetic fields act in the different turns of an inductor to begin answering that question. So here is one turn of an inductor. I'll leave the ends open. And here's the adjacent turn. And when we put current into the inductor, let's put it this direction. Doesn't really matter what direction things are going as long as we stay consistent. So the current is flowing in that direction. Of course, it's flowing in the same direction in the other inductor, but let's ignore that for now. As that current begins to flow, we get a magnetic field that builds around that. And of course, that magnetic field crosses the next turn. And when that magnetic field crosses that turn, it induces a current that flows in the opposite direction. And of course, the same thing is happening the other way. There's a magnetic field building around this turn that causes a current to try to flow in the opposite direction here. So as we put current in one way, another current is induced that pushes back. So if we go to the inductor itself, we try to push a current in this way, that current creates a magnetic field that pushes back. Now let's go back to the two turns again. So the current is flowing this way. That causes another current that opposes that. As the magnetic field is building, what's going to happen when that magnetic field collapses? Well, as it collapses, it's going the opposite direction, so the induced current will be the opposite direction. So notice that the induced current, when it is collapsing, is in the same direction as the current that causes the magnetic field. So when we try to push current into an inductor, it pushes back. But when we stop, that magnetic field collapses and pushes current in the same direction. So Mr. Milanovsky's question was, he thought that when the magnetic field collapsed, it would push current in the opposite direction. So the inducing current comes in this way, the magnetic field collapses, it pushes the opposite direction. That is incorrect. It pushes the opposite direction when the current is coming in, but when the current stops and it collapses, it tends to push in the same direction. So that's why an inductor has that flywheel effect. It's hard to get the current going, but once you get it going, it's hard to stop it. Now let's take a look at the reason for the diode across a relay. So here is the solenoid for the relay. Solenoid is a term used in physics for an inductor. We call it an inductor, they call it a solenoid. We use the term solenoid for an inductor that's used as an electromagnet to actuate something. So there's a solenoid in a relay that actuates the switch. We don't need to worry about that now, it just happens. We just want to know what's going on across this coil. Now, as we push the current in, of course, it's going to push back. The magnetic field builds, and then eventually we have that magnetic field, and that's pulling the armature, which is making the contacts do what they do. Now, when we stop that, that magnetic field is going to collapse. Now, let's take another look at the circuit. Let me clean this up a bit here. So we have some circuitry over here. There's a power source and a switch. Now the switch could be electronic or it could be mechanical. It depends on what we're doing, like in a car. Your key switch. Switch is a switch, which switches a relay, which puts more current to the starter motor. So it could be mechanical, it could be electronic. But this whole system, I'm just going to throw a resistor right here. The whole system is going to have some resistance. There's the solenoid. And we close the switch. And this resistance is going to limit the amount of current that tries to flow in there. So that magnetic field is only going to build so fast due to that resistance. But when we open the switch, there's very little resistance in here, and that magnetic field is going to collapse very rapidly. So typically, the magnetic field is going to build slowly, but when we open the circuit, it's going to collapse very rapidly. So yes, when we put current in here, we are going to get a voltage, and that voltage can exceed this voltage. So it does, depending on how fast that magnetic field tells us how much this voltage is going to be. And yes, the voltage on the building part of the cycle can exceed the voltage coming in, but it tends to exceed it a lot more when that collapses. So we need to really concentrate on mitigating that high voltage when that collapses, when we open that switch. So let's take another quick look at our voltages across here. Remember, when we are charging, or when we are building the field, let's close that switch. Our current is flowing in this direction. At this point, the inductor or the solenoid is acting like a consumer. It's basically a resistor in a way. And so the current is flowing in, conventional current is going in this way. We're going to get a higher voltage where the current goes in. So a current source, such as a battery, if it's producing current, if it's a source, we're going to get the positive side where conventional current exits. But if it's consuming, we're going to get the positive side where the conventional current enters, because it tries to go in, it's resisted, it causes a backup, so electricity backs up behind it, just like water going down a drain. We get a backup behind a slow drain. We get a backup of voltage here, so when it is building, we get positive to negative with our conventional current going in there. However, when we open that switch and that magnetic field collapses, now it's moving the opposite direction. It pushes current in the direction it was already going. Now it's pushing that energy into the system. It is now a current source. It has become essentially a battery. And so since it's a battery, since it's a source, current is going that direction. The positive side is where the current exits. So the polarity flips. So now we've got a high voltage on that polarity, and we now have a voltage spike. So how do we mitigate that? Well, we mitigate it often with a diode. And which way do we orient the diode? In that direction, because when it is building and the voltage is that polarity, we have the cathode and the anode. When the cathode is more positive than the anode, this diode looks like that. It looks like an open switch. Current does not flow. But when we reverse that, positive to the anode, negative to the cathode, now it looks like a closed switch. So that's what a diode does. Polarize it one way, it's an open switch. Reverse the polarity of the voltage, it's a closed switch. So now when that is collapsing and the current is pushing, that becomes a short circuit. So how much voltage are we going to develop across a short circuit? Well, to get voltage we need two things. We need resistance and current. How much current do we have? I don't know, a lot. But how much resistance do we have? Zero. Zero times something is nothing. So we get no voltage, essentially. It shorts it out. So we don't get that voltage spike, and that's why we put a diode in that orientation. Now the question comes up, well, what about the voltage that builds up when this is on the building cycle, or on the charging cycle, if you will? Could we not get dangerous voltages here? We could get higher voltages. It could be a problem. I've never seen this done, but I suppose we could put a Zener diode here. Makes a lot of sense that that would work, although I've done a little bit of research. I've never seen it done. I don't see any research on this being a common thing. But how about a 10-volt Zener diode? Now, for those of you who are new to this, a Zener diode is a diode where in one direction it acts like a regular diode, but in the other direction it will hold a steady voltage. As long as this voltage is greater than 10 volts, this will stay at 10 volts. And so if we are pushing the current in and that magnetic field is building fast enough to create maybe, let's say, 20 volts, well, that Zener diode is going to become a very low impedance at that voltage, such that it's going to pull that voltage back down. So it's going to take so much current through here, it'll prevent that voltage from going up, and in fact it'll prevent it from going above 10 volts. So that's a possibility. Never tried it, never heard of it being done, did some research, don't see anything about it, maybe I missed it. But yeah, that's something you could do. And of course, then when that collapses, it just acts like a regular diode. So in this case, when it's polarized this way, that is a 10 volt regulator, if you will. It will not go above 10 volts. So it keeps that voltage from going too high when it's this polarity. But then when the magnetic field collapses and we get the polarity this way, now that just acts like a regular diode. It looks like a closed switch and does what it does like the regular diode in the circuit. So that's a possibility. But that's the way we would orient the diode, because when that magnetic field is collapsing, the current goes in the same direction it was going when it was building, and so the polarity flips, and so we want to have the diode in that particular orientation to get rid of that voltage spike. Now, the other thing that seemed to be causing a little confusion, he said, well, then we have the current going round and round and round and round, and it's making my head spin. Yeah, that happens with a battery. Remember, a battery, let's just draw a regular circuit here. Now, when we think of a battery, what do we think of? We think that this is a voltage source and there are electrons going off that side and going to that side. So the electrons go here, go there, and never the twain shall meet again. That's what it does. However, it acts like that's a pump. We see electrons coming out, we see electrons going in, we see more coming out, more going in. So it looks for all the world like the electrons are going round and round and round in a circle. So my model of a battery is it is a pump that pumps electricity around the circuit. Yes, it's true that the electrons leave here and go there, and eventually they're used up and that voltage will slowly go down. At least the capacity will slowly go down because of the nature of a battery, because the electrons do not go through. But you can look at this in many ways. You can break it in half or whatever, and by golly, it sure looks like they're going through. So the battery acts like a pump. It acts like the electricity is going round and round and round. And so if that is powering a solenoid, let's put our switch here, and we open that switch, and let's put our diode here. Now that diode looks like a short circuit. And what's happening? The electricity is going round and round and round and round. At least it appears to be. Actually, the magnetic field is feeding electricity into it. It's pushing electrons this way and they're coming that way. Yeah, they would go round and round. So yes, it goes round and round and round until that energy is gone. And where does it go? Well, it's dissipated as heat. There's copper here that's got current going through it, therefore it generates power and is dissipated as heat. You may not be able to feel it or measure it, but that's what's happening. And as that heat is dissipated, as the magnetic field collapses, we eventually have no magnetic field and no moving. So yes, indeed, the current does go round and round in circles. But that's what happens as it's collapsing, goes through the diode, and it's all dissipated as heat, and that's the end of that. So just keep in mind that when we push current into an inductor, it pushes back. So current's trying to go in, it's pushing back. As time goes by, that pushback lessens because the magnetic field slows down and eventually stops. Once that magnetic field stops, the current goes through it like what it is. It's just a piece of wire. So the only resistance is what resistance is built into the wire. But when we stop that current, that magnetic field collapses and now it pushes in the same direction. So when we push current in, it pushes back. But when we try to stop the current, it pushes along and has that flywheel effect. Hard to get it going, but once it's going, it's hard to stop, and it stores that energy in that magnetic field. So I hope that clarified things. And if it didn't, please ask again. I'll try to get it right next time. So if you have any questions, please put them in the comments. I answer as many as I have time for, and sometimes other people answer them. If you found this video useful and informative, please give me a thumbs up down below. It really helps the channel. And subscribe, because that not only informs you when I put new videos up, but it really helps the channel also. And a big thank you to my patrons at Patreon. I could not make these videos without your support. If you want to help me put these videos online and keep real vocational education free at vocademy.net, you can go to patreon.com/join/vocademy and pledge your support. And again, a big thank you to my patrons who make this possible, and a big thank you to everyone for watching.